And our guest is Elizabeth Boyd Cristoforetti. She's a founding principal at Supernormal, an architecture and design research firm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Supernormal combines design expertise with emerging digital processes to balance cultural relevance with a contemporary imperative to scale beyond a single design to reach more people and more urban places. Elizabeth's background includes years of practice focused on housing, urban development, and the complex social processes required for real change in the built environment. Her current work pays careful attention to urban systems, human cultures, and evolving constraints of physical development. Elizabeth has served as a researcher at the MIT Media Lab and is currently assistant professor in practice of architecture, Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she teaches design and leads research within the Laboratory for Design Technology. She's also a member of the BSA Honors and Awards Committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Jeff and Esther and to the BSA for having me, and to all of you for coming to listen. Hopefully we'll have a conversation afterwards. Okay, so I will share my screen. And there were some audio snafus at the beginning, so let me just get myself organized here. Okay, all right. So sort of full disclosure, when Jeff and Esther approached me to talk about this, I was a little not totally sure how to approach the content, because sustainability is generally a concept that I struggle with. I have kind of not been able to fully break free from the greenwashing of the late 90s. And as a result, my practice and the research that I do in both the academy and in practice is not really about sustainability per se, but rather about the sort of value systems and the constructs that lie underneath it and that make practice what it is today. So I'm not going to have any like perfect answers for things, but I hope that what I can do is a little bit point to at least point to an interest that I have that might lead into something about the sort of systems and constructs that might get us to a productive place. All right, so in terms of level setting here, if I can, yeah, there we go. So sustainability, of course, used to be, I just wanted to at least for my own self to sort of, let's say, have a working definition about what sustainability is within the context of this talk. It used to be something about sort of being scared enough, to save the polar bears by going green, using, in our context, sustainably harvested materials, reducing embodied energy, and making buildings that are healthy for their human inhabitants and maybe less bad for the natural environment. So, but at the end of the day, the LEED Gold building is still a building, and it still has this massive carbon footprint, which is why we're all here and we're all interested in this. And today, I just, I always start this one particular class that I run with this slide, and it's a sort of an overwhelming slide, but really it's meant to have some optimism on the other side of it. There's so many contemporary imperatives right now in practice. These questions of pandemic and capital. I mean, it's even contemplating them is overwhelming. So I hope that what I'm doing in both practice, I'm going to talk a little bit about my academic work and research, and a little bit about my practice work and research. I hope is at least trying to imagine sustainability is not something that's just about the environment, but it's about something that's much more inclusive. And it's very, very, very base level. I think maybe for me, at least, sustainability is something about a hope for a better future. It's a vision for something that might include radical new thinking that's needed to achieve this change. So it's not just about the thing itself, but how we might be able to get there and what the processes are. In a way, it's sort of shorthand for our value systems. So what we're doing now, of course, only kind of works. And I would sort of put forth that what we need to be doing as architects and urban designers and designers of the built environment is something much more radical. And that would really be to focus on the structural potentials of practice in relationship to moving towards such a goal. And I would call that something like engaged practice, or kind of getting up into the systems and the infrastructures that guide our projects before they're even handed to us. And I would put on the table, just as an extreme question, whether what we're doing, whether we can even build new buildings and be talking about this. I mean, it's routine for us to discuss sustainability as an environmental imperative, to make our buildings, more energy efficient, provide absorptive landscapes, to offset runoff, so on and so forth. But we may need to consider the idea that we should be making less in a very, very dramatic way, or at least making completely different things. So it's not that we need to change the facade of our buildings, but maybe we need to radically recalibrate what it means to actually design things and put new things into the built environment, for the sake of the humans that come after us, but also the non-humans. So maybe the value system that I'll talk about today is something like this, that we can't talk about this issue of sustainability or climate without also talking about equity and economy, that they're all completely one and the same and tied together at this point in history in 2021. The engaged practice, which I'll discuss in a bit, is, it's sort of a systems linked practice that looks to the institutional origins of a lot of the biases that we have, or even the way that we kind of put together our scopes of work needs to be taken a look at. We need to be uncovering and daylighting our values, but also this really optimistic idea that what we can do in this way is actually leadership. It's not just leadership in design, it's that design is leadership for the world, which I think is really, really exciting, which is why, of course, we're sitting here at the table as designers. Also that architecture is a team sport. And most of what you're going to hear me talk about today is something that's linked into this idea that in order for us to pursue something that approaches an idea of this better world, the sustainable, the sort of systems linked practice that can really make a dent in the economy, equity, and climate conversation, we would need to be thinking about scalable systems, or at least that's my hypothesis for practice. So I'll be talking about that hypothesis through the lens of research. And now there are going to be some slides that have words on them, but then I promise after the words happen, there are going to be pictures, and hopefully they'll be pretty and engaging, and they'll be moving, and it'll be great, but there are going to be some words for a few minutes. So research in both the academy and practice is for me completely essential as a component of ethical practice, and a practice that moves towards a sort of 21st century, 2021 and on to the decades ahead version of what sustainability can and should be within our day-to-day lives as designers. So research by its nature is something that kind of picks something up, it looks at it, it turns it over, and it tries to see it in new ways. And for me, research is an idea about curiosity and care and optimism. So it happens in two modes. Just to kind of frame this, on one hand, there is design practice, and on the other hand, there is the academy. Both ends of the spectrum and everything in between, for me, focus on this question of design in an era of scalable systems, meaning that if we do things that are problematic, we're going to scale them and that the impact will be scaled. If we do things that are good, then the impact will be scaled. And so trying to figure out how we can do that a little bit is the game for me. My role, as Jeff mentioned, I do two things. I run a practice called Supernormal. And within Supernormal, we're interested in something that's a little bit above discipline, something that goes across many disciplines, trying to get at answers to these questions that I've kind of put forward. But there are things that can be hosted in practice. For the things that can't be hosted in practice, things that are maybe too far afield, or that let's say a client couldn't pay for, I pull off into the academy as research. I work for a research institution at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And so that means that I do teach courses, but my courses actually are about my own research. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today too. I'm also a principal investigator in the Laboratory for Design Technologies. And so that some of the work you'll see comes out of that vehicle as well. So this is kind of how I frame what I'm doing at the GSD. The GSD research can run ahead of practice and behind it, so it can kind of take things out of context for examination and experimentation. So a couple of things that and these are, in a way, these are kind of like, these are the kind of footnotes for the courses that I teach and for the research agendas that I have going on. So I teach one course that's really about trying to figure out and frame the idea of architecture as a discipline being actually new. And that's a very positive thing. I mean, it's only been around since the Renaissance, right? It hasn't been around for very long, actually. And if we think about what that means, and our profession is actually somewhat even newer than that, that didn't come around until industrialized cities and so on and so forth. That means it can change. And that means that the structural framework that we live with right now doesn't have to be what it is right now, that it can change. I recognize and I teach that designers bring baggage into practice, and actually that's okay, as long as we kind of daylight that, understand how we got to the table with the things that we're bringing to the table, and with the sort of intuitions that we bring to our projects. That's actually what makes us leaders and allows us to form opinions. And so that's actually a really good thing. Engaged practice is transformative practice. If we can figure out how to not just design form, but to design form that's linked up into a much richer system of technology and policy and capital, then we've done something really magical with our design skills, and we've been able to scale them. And finally, socio-technical systems and collective creativity are the future. I really believe this. Socio-technical systems are systems in which we have groups of people working together, using technology and building things and kind of co-designing alongside each other and creating something through a collective imagination, which is like quite powerful, I think. So as I mentioned, you know, this is, I don't know if anyone knows who this is. This is Alberti. He is a guy that somehow I keep finding myself coming back to. He's the architect way back in the Cinquecento who was talking about the idea of authorship. You know, architecture grew up and out as its own discipline, in large part due to Alberti and his kind of radical thinking. You know, as I said, it was not that long ago, and since the Renaissance, we've gone and there have been revolutions, and the profession emerged out of, you know, the French and you know, the French Revolution and many other things. Cities became complicated, and the profession became very useful. And now we have this moment where maybe the profession is becoming like somewhat more difficult and rigid. And so trying to figure out how we can kind of look at Alberti, understand that what he created is not static all the time, every day, and how can we kind of get out of that and get to the next step is a little bit what I'm interested in. So this is a seminar that my students are actually building it's a work in progress research. And the question behind the course here, following on this idea that practice is continuously changing, is the idea that our agency actually changes with the things that we produce. So Alberti was like making little models, and he did drawings, and you know, he was giving people drawings, and he was writing treatises. But we don't really do any of these things anymore, not in the same way. And as the things that we produce change over time, and these are kind of beautiful diagrams. They're a little opaque because the students are still working on them. But what you can see here are these little fingerprints. So we're saying the products of practice, the things that we produce in the world, are things like models and drawings, code, building text, and even the profession itself is a product of practice. And the idea here is to situate ourselves right now, to free ourselves up from the idea that things are completely fixed, and that we are, in fact, right now in an exciting new moment that's sort of like a hinge point for change. And this is how I kind of link back to this idea of what is it that we actually need to be making right now? We probably aren't going to be making the same things that we were making in 1996, right? We know we're not issuing drawing sets the same way we were. We're using Revit and components in different ways. We're creating technology. How do we look at this change? Look at how things have changed over time. And here's an example of this. This is the little thumbprint of text over time. So what you see in the y-axis is a timeline from like the beginning of time at the top until right now at the very bottom. And you see that for many years, the treatise was like the thing that people produced. This is what Alberti was writing. He was like, yes, I know what architecture is and I can write about it. This is what architecture is. And then the monograph comes in. When architects now have to sell their services in different ways, the monograph is really helpful because it helps us kind of, tell people who we are. We get the manifesto when we go through this change in the middle of last century. And now we're in this kind of funny spot where we don't know what's happening. We have Rem Koolhaas producing a treatise again with his elements of architecture. We have all these things, the discursive monologue, which frankly seem maybe to be talking just to ourselves. So we're at this kind of point, I think, and the point of the entire class actually is that there is a lot happening right now and a lot changing. It's actually not totally clear where we are or what we're producing or what will actually give us agency if we want to make impact in the world right now. But that's a decision we have to make. And so the students are looking at that and researching it. So we can go, deep into the way that we've had impact in the past with the goal of imagining a different future from the perspective of the structural potentials of practice. So that's Act 1, right? Things are changing, the products of our practice are changing, and we have agency to do something different so that we can see the impact that we want to see. The next question is, okay, well, how might we begin to do that? And so we're pursuing in another class an idea about engaged practice. What is engaged practice? Well, this is a little diagram that I made with my colleague, Paul Nakazawa, a few years ago. And what you see on the left are the conditions, things like climate and ecology, these kind of really, really big things that are like global conditions. And on the right, you have context. Context is like us right here in Boston. It could even be a local site. This is actually where projects happen. And in between, the thing you have to get to if you want the project to impact the conditions is you have to go through these constructs. There are these the things that these are our clients. These are the infrastructures of power that guide our practice. They are things like capital stacks, technology stacks, and policy frameworks and politics. And so the idea here is to kind of acknowledge these constructs as pieces that we have to interact with within this new ecosystem, that we can't actually be designers on one side or the other. We actually have to operate not just at the level of project. We can't just wait for a scope of work to come in, but we actually have to think about how it is in a more active and proactive way that we want to influence things like policy frameworks, technology stacks, and capital stacks, because otherwise we're going to be kind of pinned into this thing. And we're going to be like the Kinks. I don't know if anyone else is as much of a fan of the Kinks as I am. But I really love them. And I particularly love this song. It's, give the people what they want. And if you remember this is really about just kind of placating and pleasing people and giving people whatever they want when they ask for it. And if we aren't very, very self-aware and careful about what it is that we're doing in practice, we're going to be doing exactly this. And one could argue, based upon what I see out my window, that we already are doing that because we're in such a weak position in practice that we kind of can't quite get our footing. And so the question becomes, how do we get our footing and how do we leverage this idea of engaged practice in order to change the things that we're making and change the impact that we have in the world? It's also worth noting, and I think I have to remind myself all the time that we actually are we're a product of our own time. And we're kind of a product of the cultural myths that we've created for ourselves. I mean, in a good way and in a bad way and in all of the ways. This is a highly reductive diagram that talks about things that we've produced over time. So when we were producing the beautiful Gothic cathedrals, our value system was God, right? Like we were making it for God. In the Renaissance, we were looking at, there was humanism and the Enlightenment, knowledge and democracy, right? The scientific method, individual liberty. And then we start moving into the Industrial Revolution. Now we start actually to see the profession emerge, and manufacturing gives rise to a new class of consumer, but also a new class of architecture, something that can be a little bit more replicable if you think about things like the Crystal Palace, for instance. Now we're in this moment that's a little bit maybe murkier, or maybe some things are more clear and some things are murky. We're in this sort of post-industrial context in which things like computers and data guide our everyday, right? Things like actually artificial intelligence and the internet. And our value systems, are highly diverse actually. But when I crowdsourced this idea, these are the kind of things that came up for my students in the class. us. Our values might be things like customers. We're working for a customer, right? We're giving them what they want. We're working for corporations because that's who's paying us. We're fiduciaries to them as they're our clients. We need to scale things, again, for a better or for a worse, we have to scale them or they're not going to be profitable and we're not going to be able to see the impact. But there are also these value systems, which is why we're obviously here today, that are things like social and environmental justice. And so just kind of contextualizing this a little bit and thinking about why we're doing what we're doing and let's say what the value systems are behind things like this, right? If I can change my slide. Is it going to work? Yes, it is. So this is like what you get when you Google, multifamily housing. And this is like, we know what these are. There's the good old Dallas donuts, and we see, many of these buildings that look like many different buildings all smashed together in the same massive block. These are big aggregated parcels. And if we think about the value systems behind this, or even the cultural myths, let's say the value system is certainly profit, right? But also wanting to house people and provide more housing to try to solve and encounter the housing crisis. And the cultural myth that we're operating within is like the real estate investment trust. We all kind of buy into that. But as a result, all of our buildings look like this because the fund managers are going to only design, they want us to design the thing that made the 15% profit, not the time before. So we're kind of locked into this weird value system that we have to figure out how to get up the chain and unwind a little bit. And the same is true for the making of architecture technology, like CAD systems that determine the shape and the form and the way that we can measure the flows and everything in our buildings. We talk a lot about technology systems as amplifying factors. Designers have been at the leading edge of these for many years, but they also change with our value systems. So back in the middle of the 20th century, the goal of architectural technologies were actually really simple. The things that we were making, and I could include, things like CAD. There were all. It's sort of like the beginning of building science, which leads to a lot of the conversation that we actually have within the sustainability dialogue around carbon and energy efficiency. So. And you also have Greg Lynn doing blobs and stuff like that, right? So on one hand, we were creating these things that were trying to drive efficiency into the system, and on the other hand, trying to kind of create these new effects for architecture. But now things are amplified, especially after the recession. So now we're really feeling pressed to do things like maximize returns in a way that's accelerating even more than it was a generation ago, to meet social challenges and just because technological determinacy, because we can. So the pressures are just more and more intense. And I think it's just important to underscore that we live in this moment where there's a lot. So if those are our conditions, I suppose the question becomes, well, great, what do we do about it? How do we make things that actually will make a dent? How do we create technologies? How do we think about architecture as a technology that can encounter some of these things and sort of, let's say, change the dialogue and the discourse about what buildings in the built environment can and should be for the people and our planet. So our Urban Stack is also a research laboratory in the Laboratory for Design Technologies that I run with Carol Vulgaris. And we generally look at things like socio-technical systems. So we try to actually build technology that will begin to confront some of these issues. So we like to move from analysis to action. So we do things that look like planning, and we do things that look like design. And it's a very, very, very cross-disciplinary collaboration. And the relationship between emerging data related capacities, things like artificial intelligence, design and planning expertise, and public participation are very much at the sort of center of what we're looking at. So recent questions directly engage collective creativity and design and planning, when innovation in the public sector leads the private sector and why, issues of data standards as a reflection of social values, and platforms for collective imagination. So we collaborate a lot internally at the GSD, but we're also highly collaborative outside, meaning that we believe that collaboration actually is the future. And so we try to put it into practice. So I'll show one of those projects just to give you a flavor of what we're doing. I mean, I'm kind of the architecture scale person on this team, and Carol really operates at the level of planning. This is an effort called Open Zoning. This is an effort to confront the housing crisis through more and better knowledge of our urban places. So open zoning is a research project that makes the case that big buildings and mega impact projects, like the really big ones like the 250 unit projects that I showed a couple of slides ago, these are like the rocks and the boulders of our built environment. We're trying to make the case that actually, if we can make not the rocks and the boulders, but the sand and the gravel of our built environment effective as developable parcels, as things that we can design more systematically, we can really reduce our carbon footprint. We can really reduce the way that we make impact in the world, and we can also amplify social impact in a way that's beneficial. And so the idea here ultimately will be to open up data and information, but also systematize small scale housing. And this builds on top of work that's being done at Cornell and the Massachusetts Area Planning Council. So this is a software application. It's actually an application programming interface, an API, and an application. It's a sort of front end application with a database. What we're trying to do here is, imagine you're a small scale developer or somebody who owns a parcel of land, and you're like, wait, I think that land is really valuable now. I know I'm in an urban area and there's a lot of vacant land all over the place, even though the housing market is totally insane and, everyone's having a hard time finding housing. What if I were to try to develop some housing, like a 2 to 4 unit building, the sort of missing middle of the world? How would I go about doing that? Well, right now it's incredibly complicated. And so the ambition here is to try to take all of this information that exists out there, but not in language that a normal person can read. And certainly when, that you almost need a zoning attorney to access it oftentimes, and to make it legible, to make it, to open it up so that people can use it and play with it and understand what the value of a project could be on their site, and actually begin to think about what the design of such a project could be. And so this is just at the beginning right now. This is a very, very different kind of architecture than the kind of architecture that we practice in the world. This is actually sort of systems architecture. It's operating on the public sector in a way, and also opening up information so that local communities can advocate for change. They can do scenario driving. They can understand, for instance, what it would mean to have ADUs in everyone's backyard, and to have more access to it. So that kind of concludes my sort of sampling of some of the research that we're doing in the academy that I think is relevant to our conversation today. The next few minutes I'm going to spend talking about work that I'm doing at Supernormal. So this is research in practice. And I suppose if I could sort of summarize what it is that I'm after at Supernormal, I think, every project is a sort of question about what works and what makes a dent in the world. And when I look at our work, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, I don't see sustainability as something purely ecological. I see it as an exploration into the value systems that drive our ideas about what it means to design a better world. So it's something much deeper than issues of material and energy, though it certainly gets at that because that's sort of up the chain. Very disciplinarily agnostic. I think if we only, it's kind of that thing like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I try not to have the architecture hammer and see too many architecture nails. I try to think about, well, what would happen if we didn't solve this problem with architecture? What would it look like then? And when do we actually need architecture? So back to this idea of maybe architecture isn't always the solution. Maybe there's something else. So trying to figure out when to use which piece of our skill set and our toolkit is a big part of what we do at Supernormal. We're also very focused on the issue of scalable systems, which you'll see in a minute. I want to give a shout out here to this really remarkable author, Anna Tsing. She has written a really beautiful book called The Mushroom at the End of the World. And I'm very inspired by the idea of something like this, which is a sort of systems links design that looks at change in the natural, social, and built world. But she does it through the lens of capital, policy, politics, and technology. So she actually looks in this book at the relationship between between humans and the environment through the lens of the Matsutake mushroom and the microeconomies and the environment and the policy and politics that actually allow for it to go. And I think the Matsutake mushroom is such a beautiful little metaphor for the way that any of our efforts, our sort of scalable systems in the world, might be able to find cracks and openings in the different infrastructures that we operate within to begin to take hold and make real change. So I'm not sure if that's clear, but you should definitely read this book. It's quite good. And in a way, the diagram that I showed before for my course is relevant to me in practice as well. Supernormal does not sit necessarily in this area all the time of project and project application. We often try to work upstream and think about how to do things like many of our colleagues also do, like write zoning code and think about the design of processes for the public realm or for civic life. In relationship to the built environment that may begin to have impact not only at the architectural scale, but maybe in a more vast way. So hopefully, supernormal is a sort of practical response to the triggering conditions of our time, which are those long list of things that I had on that second or third slide. Supernormal spun out of the Media Lab about 5 years ago with a primary question, which is what are the implications of scalability in relationship to design? I was in a lab with a lot of computer programmers who cared a lot about cities, and I was looking around and realized that there were not so many designers who were caring a lot about scalable systems in the same way that the computer scientists were, and our value systems were just radically different. So I said, okay, well, what if we didn't, when we make things, let's try to make things not once, but let's try to make them many times. And of course, the question here is, can we increase the agency and reach of our design values through scale? And I don't know that we can be contemporary without doing that, actually. So I think supernormal also embodies a very serious tension, at least for me, which is one that comes from a design that cares very much for our discipline in our craft, and yet acknowledges the traditional sort of form first practice that Alberti was really good at and remarkable, right? And sort of grew our discipline. Maybe this kind of practice is not meeting the world as it is in 2022. And so the projects really become laboratories here for us to begin to look at how we can make a dent in different ways. Not abandoning architecture, I want to be clear, because it's very important, but using it when it's needed. So one of the efforts that we have is to kind of make the world more legible, make the built environment more legible, to use technology to uncover and visualize conditions and set a platform for participation, advocacy, and change through design. So even before a design project gets catalyzed or funded, how do we help people to understand what exists in the world right now and in a way that will allow them to begin to sit down, look at something, learn about it, learn about maybe even their own neighborhood from a different perspective, connect to it in ways that they hadn't before, and sort of see different narratives, and then begin to advocate for themselves and even take part in something that approaches something like civic creativity. And the transformation of the built environment. And so we have an interest in kind of daylighting algorithms. Algorithms in sort of dumb and smart ways are responsible for a lot of decisions in the public realm. Redlining and discrimination in the last century is a very famous one that was carried on by insurance companies and lenders. And so as we start to think about how we integrate, especially on the eve of like this whole idea of a smart city, what can a smart city be? How do we daylight algorithms and daylight the value systems underneath them so that we can, when we go in and we not only analyze things and understand what's possible and what's happening in an area right now, but what should happen in the future, we can do it well. This is a project we did at the city of Boston. We went in and again, we did build on the work of other people. The Mayor's Office of Urban Mechanics had already done great work. They've been building on the work of MAPC and others. And we kind of came in and took a look at a decision-making algorithm that decided where to improve the public realm first. So we had an index effectively of all of these different data sets, and we were bringing them together and weighting them and unweighting them and deciding, well, where should we, if we are going to fix a sidewalk, where are we going to fix the sidewalk first? We can choose to fix sidewalks that are broken. We have a data set that shows that. We can decide to fix things that are like highly walkable or accessible to the T or Fenway Park, right? Maybe we need to just always fix Fenway first because it's always so active. Or you can fix stuff where there's a lot of social need, where people have a really hard time getting to public transit, where there are people who are very young and very old, where there are people that are disabled or have other, let's say structural biases in place that make their lives a lot harder than others. So we have to figure out exactly how to weight these, because at the end of the day, some sidewalk is going to get fixed and some decision is going to be made. And this is a way of sort of opening that up and systematizing it. So we built a little application that allows people to go in, and when you pull that triangle up to the red, you can prioritize fixing sidewalks. When you pull it down to the blue, you're going to be prioritizing fixing things that are highly walkable, like Fenway Park. You can see Fenway light up there, right, in yellow. So yellow is like, fix this first, and blue is like, ignore this completely. If we were to pull it over to green, let's say, then we would say, no, actually, we need to prioritize decision-making around spending money in places where people have the most social need. So you can see how that changes. And suddenly, this little algorithm, if we can open it up and allow people to understand that this is kind of the basis of a smart city, it's just, at the end of the day, it's a bunch of people who have to kind of sit around and say, this is what we value, and this is how we make decisions. Then we can start to have a good dialogue about how change can happen. And this is another piece of it that actually, I mean, very funny. It's 311 calls. 311 calls aren't usually visualized. These are when you kind of call and you're like, somebody's in my parking space again, like there's trash on the street, city, please help me. We can kind of visualize what kinds of calls are happening and where people are worried about things, but also how quickly they're answered. And so you see here, actually, I think this one is Southie, like that's the amount of Southie has a lot of issues with parking, right? And so we can see that very, very, very quickly. So suddenly we can have these kind of micro narratives about neighborhoods. Part of this project was opening it up and talking to the community about it. This was an exhibition we actually designed to begin to daylight this conversation about smart cities. We designed this sort of strange object that's something that is very sort of soft and human and visible to encounter the very sort of slick and invisible technologies that we tend to affiliate with smart cities. And you can see here this was a partnership with the Boston Public Library. So we're able to have conversations with people about what they wanted to see in their neighborhood. They could understand their neighborhood and the neighborhoods near them and the communities near them in different ways. And then they could start making recommendations about how to make change or to understand where change should happen in the city. And there's a component of this that is just delightful, I think, which I personally, I think the idea that a smart city can be like dirty and fluffy and soft and human is a really optimistic thing. And I still think at the end of the day that delight really matters in design. This is a sort of humorous little thing we did at the end of it, because for all of the seriousness that this conversation is, and for all of the seriousness about solving issues related to equity and climate and social justice, at the end of the day, humans are still consuming design, and we still have to make it delightful. So then this is the other project that I'll show us from practice, then I'll wrap it up. I think I might actually go through this quickly because I started late because of my audio problems. This is a housing project. This is a project called Bit by Bit that merges urbanism, technology, and architecture. And it's not a success for a variety of reasons that I can share, but the reason that it has failed is actually quite important. So I wanted to bring it up. I'm actually just going to go to the next slide. That's it. That previous slide is a diagram of this, which is to say that this is in Charlotte. We are expanding greenfield development very, very, very quickly. Greenfield development is not only a huge burden to the environment in the sense that it is colonizing areas that were previously wild, it is also doing things like creating racial disparity and economic disparity, right? So there's a little cluster of houses that's 1.25 million. It would never, there needs to be a highway between that cluster of houses and the house that is 375,000, right? So there's an idea that there's very little diversity happening here. And so there's a question about how do we better systematize more diverse and more types of housing for the world. We built a kind of I suppose you could call it a system or a process. It's a vertically integrated system. The idea here being that we actually want to systematize the delivery of 2 to 4 family homes. Speaks to many of the points that I've made leading up to this, but long story short, we realized very quickly that we needed to get involved with developers, people who are doing finance, and even groups like Fannie Mae who became partnerships with us. And so we created this whole system about how we might be able to deliver a home. And so this 2 to 4 family thing, makes strides, because much like the triple decker, you can have somebody buy such a thing, rent out the bottom, and become and create a more sustainable place for them to live in their own community or in a new community. So there's an idea about density here. There's an idea about product delivery. This happens to be a very, very smart core. It's kind of embedded with a variety of things that things like electricity and all the things that the trades need to be dealing with that can be manufactured offsite. And then it's surrounded by really, really simple products. And so it's a componentized system that gets delivered to site. And we were working with a large property developer actually in Charlotte on this project. In the end, it was a bit sad, because we found that for as much potential as it had, the funding mechanisms, funding something like this, something that is technology and architecture and urbanism, is incredibly complicated, because we need to be able to build the technology to make it scalable, but venture capitalists do not want to get involved in funding the built environment, because it's complicated, because people are complicated, and because sites are complicated. So it's not a good target for venture capital. On the other hand, it can't purely be funded by normal development related lending, because the technology needs to be built, and technology development can't be supported by project-based funding. So, I think this really underscores this issue of how the systems that are set up underneath architecture guide what we can and can't do in a really serious way. And until we are successful at efforts like Bit by Bit, we can kind of continue to push that boulder up the hill and figure out how we can make systems that will be able to make an impact and a dent to change, let's say, the economic infrastructure that yields the housing that is in the world right now. It's going to be very hard for us to make any substantive impact, beyond changing a facade. And so sometimes I feel a bit depressed by it, but then I also feel very optimistic about it, because we did get this really far. This went to a federal agency. So at any rate, I that's all to say, big failure, but I learned a lot, and I think there's something productive there to build on. I'm going to skip this last project, and I'm going to wrap it up. This is about adaptive reuse and strategic design, but I will go to the last page so that we have time.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Well, I don't want to take long story short, in case there wants to be, any conversation on the other side of it, because I'd love to hear the thoughts of anyone who's on the line. Adaptive reuse obviously still makes a lot of sense. We somehow over the pandemic came in contact with a number of buildings or, assets, as it were, that had been renovated in the 80s. And so we've become sort of like weird specialists at 1980s renovations. But they're interesting because, not just because they reject the idea of destroying a building to make a new one, but because they become this sort of strange and rich hybrid as a result. And we have found ourselves really loving this kind of ugly beauty that requires the inhabitants to remember that there is actually no clean slate here, that we're always kind of building on top of something, and that we're always attached to the past and the present. And this was a project that we got involved at the strategic level. It was a project about shaping project-based pedagogy at a secondary and middle school. This school, and we really, it was fascinating, because before there was even design, we came in and we talked about strategic design and pedagogy and what the school should be, that it should reject industrialized education in favor of a model that personalizes education and emphasizes integration with the natural, social, and digital context equally. So you can see right there, we're like baking value systems into the scope of work that we're writing for ourselves, that is now going to dictate the way that we think about design in relationship to, again, our natural, social, and digital context as completely interlinked. So this is a project that gained its disposition as a sort of third teacher in a way within a school that was west of here. So there's a master plan and a whole lot of work that went into the site and thinking about how to tap into the learning landscapes of the natural environment, but also into these kind of classroom typologies that were able to link the natural environment back to learning about technology and society. And you know, for us, it was an exciting project because we got to do a lot more than architecture. And we got to think about things like journey maps and things that usually product designers are thinking about. We were suddenly in the room with the founders having that conversation and having a real and substantive impact. So I suppose this is another maybe smaller way, but at the more traditional scale of architecture, you know, idea about how we might begin to get involved in projects to imbue them with a value system before we receive the brief, to begin to work up the chain to shape the idea of what a building can and should be in relationship to both its social and natural context. So that is it.
It's a
Thank you.
Do you traditionally have conversations?
We have a little time for questions.
Okay. Who is, let me, I can stop share in case there's.
Speak up, or if you prefer, you can put questions in the chat.
Feel free to do either. If you want to unmute yourself and are interested in asking a question, I would be very happy to answer or have a conversation.
I will just take a moment to thank Elizabeth for the wonderful presentation. There's a lot being covered, and I really appreciate that. Thank you for showing us to provide a glimpse of what happened in the academic world, and also what happens in your practice. And I really enjoy some of the clarity that the insights that I see from this presentation. Two of my favorites. One is sustainability. At the 21st emerging world, you see it as a hope for a better future. And the other one is architecture. It's not building on a clean slate. We just mentioned that it's building with past, present, and future all together. And I think that was something that's really wonderful. I want to say, just want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Esther.
And so I don't know if people could hear us in the room. We're presenting in person, but please feel free to put in questions or observations for our seminar.
I have a question. Whoops.
We think of studying architecture as learning form making, and it seems that you are looking at architectural practice as requiring or encouraging a much broader skill set.
Or let's say a different form of decision making and judgment about how to engage with architecture at the very least. So not everyone is going to come to the table designing software. Though, to be honest with you, one of my colleagues just emailed me last night and said, I took a poll in my professional practice class. There were 57 students, and I asked how many of you were going to go on to be an architect, and 6 raised their hand. So I think we also have to acknowledge that we architects don't get paid a lot. It's not necessarily the most lucrative field to go into. When we come out, it's easy to be disillusioned because we kind of get, you know, often the buildings kind of design themselves in one way, shape, or form. And so we're seeing students come out of architecture school going into other practices. And so we find ourselves needing to balance really respecting and honoring our craft and our discipline, which are super important. Beautiful form still matters, but with an idea about what expanded practice can be and how we help students like that. The 50 students out of the 56 that are not going to go into architectural practice, they're going to be in some adjacent practice that are going to be taking the value system of architecture and translating it. So it's, to be honest with you, it's challenging because we want to do the right thing for the future of our built environment by creating highly knowledgeable connoisseurs of form and craft, and at the same time, responsible people in the world. And I think the thing that I worry about the most is this idea that that you have to choose one thing, that you either have to choose practice that is about making form or practice that is about like social justice in the environment. And that's totally nonsensical. That's like some weird 20th century idea that like came out of polarized political landscape. And it just has nothing to do with architectural practice, but yet it lives on. And I think trying to figure out how we can get beyond that is really key.
A lot of that must be who pays for it, who the clients.
Yeah. Yeah, or what practice you decide to join and what projects are you going after? I mean, because I think this idea, like I run a practice and somebody pays me. So, it's not like I have 100 people lining up and I get to choose. But anytime we create a practice and we design our practices, we're designing an idea about what we want to make in the world, and we're kind of selling a certain value system that people are going to buy. And so trying to help people who are emerging from school decide which practice they want to be a part of and how they want to practice and how they want to sell themselves in the world, I think is part of it. But yes, of course, we still have to keep the office afloat. So.
My question was kind of about.
Oh, I can't hear you, James.
Yeah. Oh, really? I'm not muted.
Maybe it's because, hold on one second. Okay, can you try to talk now?
Sure. Can you hear me now? No?
I can hear you, James.
Yeah, I can hear you, James.
Oh. Maybe it's the speaker. Yeah.
Okay, James, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? No? I think
we still can't hear you. Could you type it into the chat? I'm so sorry. We're really having a hard time with the audio today. Oh, okay. And I see something from Larry too. So James, while you're typing in, Larry Sprang said, I'm intrigued by your work at the Marlborough campus. Yes. Sounds like you've done some work out there too. It's a very curious collection of buildings. Glad you're looking at it more holistically. Yeah, Larry, we can have an offline about that one sometime.
I recognized that instantly and I said, oh my gosh, somebody else.
But
yeah, no, feel free
maybe
to
we should have a drink to like have therapy about that.
Yeah, there's some thought to that.
I'm so sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, it is an interesting collection. It's a crazy mid-century. It's not even, it's like from the 70s and early 80s, and it's like a very aggressive brick, but the site's beautiful. The site is incredibly beautiful. That was a very complicated pandemic project for us. We took it through early DD, and then the client, I think, had some other ideas about a variety of things. So we are not on that project anymore. But
familiar.
It was great. Hopefully you are. Hopefully you're designing it better than we did. Nope.
Nope.
I think we were the third architect. So
yeah, we were number 2.
Oh, you were the second. Okay, you were right before us. Good.
So.
All right. So James says, I was interested to learn why you consider the housing type was a failure. In what way? Yeah, good. That's a really good question. It's a failure because there aren't like 100,000 of them in the world right now. We had gotten some initial funding for this. I really quickly realized that we were going to have to spin that project. It was something that we started internally in Supernormal, sort of on our off hours, and we were hired by a developer to then implement it in the South. But once we realized that we were going to need to make it into a spin out of Supernormal, so its own company that would go off and do its own things, that needed a different corporate structure and different funding. It was never going to be client funded. We had to go get, we tried to go get funding. Basically that's when we ran up against VCs who were all very, very, very excited until because everyone's trying to get into the housing, but at the end of the day, the VCs in housing are all trying to fund only digital. So they're trying to fund software, like financial instruments and other things that don't touch architecture. No one wants to touch anything that's affiliated with architecture because it's very, very, very risky. And so for us, it was a fail because we were not able to, and actually, I don't think it's actually a failure of us per se, but it's a failure of the world in the sense that these kind of the missing middle is still missing for these reasons. And we can't systematize it for these reasons because there just isn't the proper, like, funding with the right disposition that's both interested in seeing profit, but interested in seeing profit more slowly than a venture capitalist. So it's not a 10x return over 3 years. We were looking at a 3x return over 10 years. And that's not really something that kind of capital wanted. And so we just couldn't find an alignment. The pandemic hit and it kind of fizzled. But if anyone has any ideas, let me know. I'm still interested in pushing it along.
Okay. Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for showing up. I appreciate it. Thanks, Sarah. And maybe I'll see you in person sometime.
Thank you.
All right, I'll sign off.